Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving straight into a really heated debate going on right now, all centered around Amazon founder Jeff Bezos and his recent comments on billionaire wealth and taxes. To cut through all the noise, we're going to lean on some fantastic analysis by financial commentator Alson and Boston College law professor Madoff. They recently took a magnifying glass to Bezos' arguments, and man, what they found is fascinating. It reveals this massive gap between what billionaires say in public and how our tax code actually works behind the scenes. So if you've ever wanted to know how wealth truly operates at the absolute highest levels, you are definitely in the right place. Let's get into it. Here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll cover 1. Wealth versus the budget, 2. The tax rate gap, 3. The buy, borrow, die strategy, 4. The billionaire child tax credit, and finally, number 5, the politics of protection. All right, starting things off with Section 1, wealth versus the budget, and the sheer scale of billionaire wealth. To really wrap our heads around this debate over whether billionaires should pay more in taxes, we first have to grasp the astronomical scale of the wealth we're even talking about here. $55 trillion. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is not the total economy of the United States. No, that is the total wealth controlled exclusively by the richest 1% of Americans right now. So when Jeff Bezos argues that raising taxes on the wealthy won't inherently help Americans, well, critics immediately point right back to this exact figure. And this comparison perfectly illustrates why that massive pool of wealth actually matters to all of us. On one hand, you've got that $55 trillion held by the top 1%, and on the other, the entire annual United States federal budget, sitting at roughly $7 trillion. To put that into perspective, remember that the U.S. recently faced a $2 trillion budget shortfall. As Alson points out, when the wealth disparity is literally this huge, the tax contributions of the richest Americans absolutely dictate the financial health of the entire country. Moving right along to Section 2, the tax rate gap. Who really pays? In a recent interview, Jeff Bezos made a very specific claim to defend the current tax setup. He said, the top 1% pay 40% of the income taxes. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a colossal contribution, right? And it's the absolute cornerstone of his argument that the wealthy are already carrying their fair share of the country's financial burden. But we've got to ask the critical question here. Is this really the whole story? Well, when we zoom in on the data through the lens of Professor Madoff's analysis, we find something pretty interesting. While Bezos' statistic is technically true, it actually functions as a bit of a masterclass in misdirection. The key here is understanding exactly who makes up that top 1% of taxpayers. You see, Professor Madoff points out that the 40% figure Bezos mentioned is driven almost entirely by high-income earners. We're talking highly paid doctors, lawyers, and financial executives. These are folks who earn huge salaries and, depending on where they live, might easily pay an effective tax rate of around 50%. But the ultra-wealthy, the billionaires, they operate in a completely different universe. They actively avoid generating taxable income in the traditional sense. Because their wealth is tied up in appreciating assets and stock rather than a standard W-2 salary, paying taxes under our current system essentially becomes optional for them. And when you separate those salaried high earners from the billionaire class, a pretty stark contrast pops up. The top 400 richest Americans pay an effective tax rate of about 24%. But meanwhile, the average working American pays a tax rate closer to 30%. Yep, you heard that right. The system is structurally built in a way that often demands a higher percentage from everyday citizens than from the literal wealthiest individuals in the country. Which brings us to Section 3, the buy, borrow, die strategy and avoiding taxable events. Okay, this is essentially the holy grail of billionaire tax avoidance, and it operates in 3 remarkably simple steps. Step 1, buy and hold appreciating assets, like massive amounts of company stock. Step 2, never sell those assets. Why? Because selling triggers a capital gains tax. Instead, you just borrow cash against those assets to fund your lifestyle. Since loans are classified as debt and not income, they are completely tax-free. And finally, step 3, die, and pass those assets on to your heirs through what's called a stepped-up basis. This completely erases the income tax liability on all those gains made during your lifetime. Interestingly, when Bezos was asked directly about this exact buy, borrow, die strategy by an interviewer, Alson notes that he completely dodged the question. He claimed he doesn't do that, but he completely avoided addressing the structural reality of the loophole itself. The consequence of this strategy is, frankly, profound. Because wealth can just grow infinitely without ever being taxed as income, the top 1% now controls more wealth than the entire American middle class combined. Ed Alson and Ray Madoff argue that these billionaires simply want to keep kicking the can down the road. They want to avoid a real conversation about the fact that this level of unchecked wealth inequality is rapidly reaching a breaking point in our society. Let's look at a real-world example in Section 4, the Billionaire Child Tax Credit and the 2011 tax leak. We need to walk through this timeline because it perfectly illustrates the utter absurdity of the current tax code. So back in 2011, Jeff Bezos actually claimed a child tax credit on his federal returns. This fact stayed completely hidden for years until some confidential IRS records were leaked, which laid bare the complex tax strategies of the ultra-rich. Today, that incident is used as a primary example in the debate over how billionaire taxes are fundamentally voluntary when compared to the rest of the workforce. So how much did he actually get? Well, he received exactly $4,000, breaking down to $1,000 per child. Now you're probably wondering, why on earth was a billionaire even eligible for a tax credit specifically designed to help everyday middle-class families make ends meet? It's because, legally speaking, Bezos' on-paper taxable income was artificially low that year. He offset his income with so many investment losses and deductions that the IRS algorithm literally categorized him alongside low to moderate income families. Crazy, right? This leads to a brilliantly sarcastic, but painfully accurate, summary from the analysts. Salaries are for suckers. If you work for a living and earn a standard paycheck, you are locked into a burdensome tax system. There's just no escaping it. But if you live off investments, capital, and inheritances, you can manipulate your on-paper income so drastically that you can actually claim government assistance credits. For that tier of wealth, taxes aren't a civic duty. They are literally just an optional expense to be managed and minimized. Finally, we've Section 5, the politics of protection and protecting the wealth. Recently, Jeff Bezos made headlines by publicly praising Donald Trump. He stated that Trump is, quote, a more mature, more disciplined version of himself than in his first term. Now, this pivot surprised a lot of people, especially given their historically contentious relationship. So, how do financial analysts interpret this sudden change in tone from one of the world's richest men? Well, according to Ed Alson's analysis, we really shouldn't be taking this quote at face value. Alson argues that this is fundamentally a bad faith argument. The assessment here is that Bezos is strategically maneuvering to gain political favor. By getting on the good side of political power, he's doing what he believes is necessary to protect Amazon, its shareholders, and its market dominance. But even beyond corporate interests, Alson suggests it's a calculated move to shield Bezos' own massive personal wealth from any future IRS scrutiny or intensive tax investigations. In this view, public praise is essentially just a protective moat built around a $55 trillion fortress of elite wealth. And that brings us right back to the core theme of today's explainer, leaving us with a pretty critical question to ponder. Are public stances on policy and politics simply calculated strategies to protect private wealth? When billionaires speak out on taxes or political figures, are we genuinely hearing civic discourse, or are we just witnessing the mechanics of wealth preservation in real time? It's a hugely complex issue, but by breaking down the math, the loopholes, and the rhetoric like we did today, we can start to see the real story behind the headlines. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep asking those tough questions, and I'll see you next time.